The sound of breaking glass pierced the heavy silence of the Colorado City saloon, as Violet Lawson stared defiantly at the shards scattered across the worn wooden floor. It was 1876, and the Colorado Territory had just become the 38th state, but for Violet, the promise of new beginnings seemed as distant as the eastern cities she'd fled 3 months prior. "You stupid girl," Howard Wilkins, the saloon owner, roared as he rushed from behind the bar. His jowls quivered with rage, his face reddening to a dangerous shade of crimson. "That's the third glass this week. I hired you out of pity, but I'm starting to think everyone in town was right about you." Violet's hands trembled as she knelt to gather the broken pieces. The whispers that followed her through town had become a familiar, unwelcome companion. Daughter of the town drunk, Eastern schoolgirl with fancy ideas, a hopeless case, a waste. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilkins. It slipped. Everything slips with you, doesn't it?" He towered over her, the stench of tobacco and whiskey heavy on his breath. "Just like your father. You know what they're saying in town? That apple didn't fall far from the tree." The saloon had gone quiet, every patron watching the scene unfold with the hungry eyes of men starved for entertainment. Violet felt heat rising to her cheeks as she continued collecting shards of glass, her fingertips already dotted with tiny cuts. "I'll pay for it from my wages," she said quietly, willing her voice not to break. "Your wages?" Wilkins let out a bark of laughter. "Girl, at this rate you'll owe me money by week's end." "Maybe your fancy Eastern education didn't teach you how to hold onto a simple glass, but out here in Colorado, we value competence." The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of late autumn air and the silhouette of a tall man. Dust clung to his long coat, and the spurs on his boots jingled softly as he crossed the threshold. Few patrons paid him any mind, their attention still fixed on Violet's humiliation. "They call me a waste," she said suddenly, rising to her feet with the broken glass clutched in her palm. Blood trickled between her fingers, but she seemed not to notice. "That's what you're all thinking, isn't it? That I'm just a waste of space like my father." Wilkins' face contorted with discomfort at her directness. "Now, I didn't say. You didn't have to." Violet's voice carried through the saloon, stronger now despite the tears threatening to spill. "I've heard it since the day I came back. Violet Lawson, the promising girl who went east to study and came back to nothing but a drunk father and a run-down cabin." The newcomer paused at the bar, his hat still pulled low over his eyes as he observed the confrontation. His weathered hands rested lightly on the counter, patient and still. "Well, maybe if you'd applied yourself instead of coming back with your tail between your legs," Wilkins began, but stopped when the stranger cleared his throat. "Whiskey," the man said, his voice deep and calm like distant thunder. "And another glass for the lady." He finally lifted his head, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, yet younger than his demeanor suggested, perhaps 30 at most. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, met Violet's. "She's just broken one," Wilkins protested. "And she's not a customer, she works here." Or did, until about 30 seconds ago. The stranger placed a silver dollar on the counter. "Then consider this her severance pay." Wilkins' eyes darted between the coin and the man's steady gaze before snatching the money with a grunt. "Fine. Get your things from the back, Violet. We're done here." Violet stood frozen, blood dripping onto the floor from her cut hand, humiliation and anger warring within her. "I don't need your charity," she told the stranger through gritted teeth. The man didn't flinch. "It's not charity, it's a proposition." This stirred interest around the saloon, and Violet's eyes flashed dangerously. "I'm not that kind of woman, Cowboy." A hint of a smile touched his lips. I'm looking for someone to help with accounts at my ranch. Word is you're educated. Can you cipher?" Yes," she stammered, thrown by the unexpected turn. "I studied mathematics." "Then I'll spend every day proving them wrong," he said simply, nodding toward Wilkins and the murmuring patrons. "Those who call you a waste. The position pays $3 a week with room and board." "My name is Daniel Xavier. My ranch is 10 miles north." The saloon erupted in low whispers. Everyone knew of the Xavier Ranch, a modest but growing operation run by a man who kept mostly to himself. There were rumors about Daniel Xavier, that he'd been a Union officer in the war, that he'd killed men in Kansas during the border disputes, that he'd come west to escape something dark in his past. But no one knew for certain, and he volunteered nothing. Violet stared at him, searching for the trick, the trap, the inevitable disappointment. "Why would you offer me work? You don't know me." "I know enough," Daniel replied, accepting the whiskey Wilkins grudgingly slid toward him. "I know this town is quick to judge and slow to forgive. I know what it's like to be measured by another man's actions." His eyes flickered briefly to her bleeding hand. "And I know talent when I see it. Do you accept?" Violet glanced around the saloon at Wilkins' sour expression, at the curious and judgmental faces of men who'd watched her struggle for months without offering a kind word. What choice did she truly have? Her father's debts had consumed what little money remained after her mother's funeral had brought her rushing home from school. There were no other establishments in Colorado City likely to hire her now. "I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I don't need your pity, Mr. Xavier." Daniel downed his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass firmly on the counter, and nodded. "Good, because I don't offer it. Get your things and tend to that hand. I'll wait outside." He turned and strode toward the door, spurs jingling with each step. "You're making a mistake, Xavier," Wilkins called after him. "That girl's nothing but trouble, just like her old man." Daniel paused at the door, turning just enough for his profile to be visible against the late afternoon light. "The only mistake," he said quietly, "would be judging her by your small-minded standards rather than her own merit." Then he was gone, leaving a charged silence in his wake. Violet exhaled slowly, unclenching her fist to reveal the bloody shards of glass embedded in her palm. Perhaps this new arrangement would end in disaster like everything else since she'd returned to Colorado, but for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope, she'd learned better than to hope, but it was something close to determination. She hurried to the back room, wrapped her bleeding hand in a handkerchief, and gathered her meager belongings, a worn shawl, a small book of poetry, and her mother's silver hairbrush. The possessions of a life interrupted, a future derailed. When she stepped outside, Daniel Xavier was waiting beside a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. He didn't speak as he helped her up onto the seat, his touch impersonal yet somehow gentler than she'd expected. And as they pulled away from the saloon from Colorado City, Violet didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. The journey to the Xavier Ranch passed mostly in silence. The early November landscape rolled by in shades of brown and gold, the distant mountains already capped with snow. Occasionally Daniel would point out a landmark or name a distant peak, but he didn't press Violet for conversation, seeming to understand her need for quiet contemplation. "Your hand," he said finally as the sun began to set, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and purples. "We should stop and tend to it properly." Violet looked down at the blood-stained handkerchief. The pain had dulled to a persistent throb. "It's fine. I've had worse." "I'm sure you have," he replied, surprising her with his perception. "But infection doesn't care about your resilience." There's a creek ahead. We'll stop there." His tone brooked no argument, so Violet remained silent as they pulled up alongside a small stream lined with cottonwoods. Daniel helped her down from the wagon, then retrieved a small medical kit from beneath the seat. "Sit," he instructed, pointing to a flat rock by the water's edge. He knelt before her, unwrapping the handkerchief with unexpected gentleness. "This will sting," he warned, producing a flask from inside his coat and pouring whiskey over her cuts. Violet hissed but didn't pull away. "You're wasting good whiskey, Mr. Xavier." "Daniel," he corrected, focused on removing tiny fragments of glass still embedded in her palm. "And it's not waste if it serves a purpose, much like people." She studied him as he worked the careful precision of his movements, the slight furrow between his brows as he concentrated. His hands were strong but dexterous, calloused from labor yet capable of this delicate task. "Why did you really offer me this position?" she asked suddenly. "There must be plenty of people who could keep your accounts, people without my reputation." Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I need someone who can read, write, and calculate, someone intelligent enough to learn quickly and desperate enough not to leave at the first difficulty." He returned to bandaging her hand. "And perhaps I know something about being judged unfairly." "What do they say about you?" Violet asked, her curiosity overcoming her caution. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Many things, none of them the complete truth. That I'm running from the law. That I killed men in the war and couldn't stop after it ended. That I have a secret fortune or a secret wife or both. And the truth is mine to tell when I choose." He tied off the bandage neatly. "As yours is yours." Violet flexed her fingers experimentally. "Thank you." Daniel nodded once, then rose to his feet. "We should continue. It'll be dark soon and the trail gets treacherous." As they resumed their journey, Violet found herself wondering what kind of man Daniel Xavier really was and what kind of situation she'd gotten herself into. But as the wagon crested a hill and a small valley spread before them, these thoughts momentarily vanished. The Xavier Ranch lay nestled against the backdrop of foothills, modest but well-maintained. A sturdy main house built of logs and stone stood flanked by a barn, stables, and several smaller outbuildings. Fenced pastures stretched in 3 directions, and even in the fading light, Violet could make out cattle grazing in the distance. "It's not much," Daniel said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment. "But it's growing. No, it's—" Violet searched for the right word. "It looks like a home." Something in Daniel's expression softened momentarily before his usual reserve returned. "You'll stay in the small cabin behind the main house. It was built for a foreman, but I haven't hired one yet. You'll take your meals in the main house with me and Mrs. Holloway." "Mrs. Holloway, my housekeeper. She comes 3 days a week from town. The rest of the time we fend for ourselves." He guided the horses down the slope toward the ranch. "She's a widow, about 60. Good woman, but she'll talk your ear off if you let her." As they approached the main house, a light appeared in the window and a plump figure emerged onto the porch, lantern held high. "You're late, Mr. Xavier." The woman called, her voice carrying easily through the crisp evening air. "Supper's gone cold and I was about to," she broke off as she spotted Violet. "Well now, who's this you've brought?" Daniel halted the wagon before the house. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Violet Lawson. She'll be keeping the ranch accounts. Miss Lawson, Mrs. Eleanor Holloway." The older woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline as she assessed Violet with keen interest. "Lawson, Horace Lawson's girl, the one who went back east." Violet stiffened, bracing herself for the inevitable judgment, but Mrs. Holloway surprised her. "Well, thank the Lord. This place needs a woman's touch and someone with proper schooling." She bustled down the steps, still clutching her lantern. Mr. Xavier's idea of bookkeeping is shoving receipts into a cigar box until tax time. Nearly drove me to drink last spring trying to sort it all out. Daniel cleared his throat. Miss Lawson has had a trying day, Mrs. Holloway. Perhaps we could continue introductions inside. Of course, of course. You must be exhausted, dear. Come in, I'll heat up supper. She peered more closely at Violet. Land's sake, what happened to your hand? An accident, Violet replied, allowing Daniel to help her down from the wagon. It's nothing serious. We'll be in shortly, Daniel told Mrs. Holloway. I need to show Miss Lawson to her cabin first and see to the horses. Mrs. Holloway nodded, though her curious gaze lingered on them both before she returned to the house. Daniel led Violet around the main house, to a small but well-constructed cabin about 50 yards behind it. He produced a key, unlocked the door, and lit a lamp just inside the entrance, revealing a simple but clean interior, a small sitting room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom visible through a doorway, and a tiny kitchen area. It's basic, he said, but sound. Stove works, chimney draws well. There's a pump out back for water. He handed her the key. Get settled. Come to the main house when you're ready for supper. He turned to go, but Violet called after him. Mr. Zav Daniel. He paused, looking back at her. Thank you, she said simply. Daniel nodded once, then disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Violet alone in her new home. She looked around the small cabin, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the braided rug before the fireplace, the small bookshelf with perhaps a dozen volumes. It was simple, but compared to the cramped room she'd rented in town or worse. Her father's dilapidated cabin with its leaking roof and perpetual smell of cheap whiskey, it was palatial. Violet set her few belongings on the table and slowly sank into a chair, the events of the day finally catching up to her. She'd lost her job, been publicly humiliated, and somehow ended up miles from town with a man she barely knew, dependent on his goodwill. It could be the beginning of something better, or it could be another terrible mistake in a life that seemed increasingly defined by them. But as she rose to wash her face in the basin provided, Violet made a silent promise to herself. Whatever this opportunity was, she wouldn't waste it. She would prove her worth to Daniel Xavier, to Colorado City, and most importantly, to herself. When Violet entered the main house 30 minutes later, the aroma of beef stew and fresh bread immediately made her stomach growl. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. She'd been too busy taking inventory of her cabin, discovering its small comforts. The quilt on the bed, the lamp oil already stocked, the kindling laid in the fireplace. Someone had prepared for her arrival with care, though she couldn't imagine Daniel Xavier handling such domestic details. Mrs. Holloway greeted her with a broad smile, ushering her to a solid oak table where Daniel already sat. There you are, dear. Sit, sit. I've kept everything warm. The housekeeper bustled about, ladling stew into bowls and slicing bread still steaming from the oven. Mr. Xavier told me you'd be handling the accounts. That's a blessing, truly. Numbers give me a headache, something fierce. Daniel watched the interaction quietly, his expression neutral but attentive. He'd removed his coat and hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. Without the shadow of his hat brim, his features were more pronounced: strong jawline, straight nose, those startlingly blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. How's your hand feeling? He asked as Mrs. Holloway set a bowl before Violet. Better, thank you. Violet carefully flexed her bandaged fingers. I should be able to write without difficulty. Good. We'll start tomorrow. He turned his attention to his meal, and for several minutes the only sounds were those of eating and Mrs. Holloway's occasional commentary on local happenings. "Sheriff Burns' wife had her baby last week," she informed them, settling into a chair with her own bowl. "A healthy boy, their third. And the McCreadys are selling their place, moving to Denver, they say, though everyone knows it's because they can't make the payments after that bad investment in the silver mine." Violet ate silently, savoring food that was both plentiful and well-prepared, two qualities that had been scarce in her recent existence. Mrs. Holloway seemed content to carry the conversation, requiring only occasional nods of acknowledgement. "And then there's the business with the railroad survey," the housekeeper continued. "They're saying the line might come through just south of Colorado City, which would certainly change things. Property values would rise, of course, but so would the riff-raff." She glanced at Violet. "Your father's still in that cabin out by Fountain Creek?" Violet set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminished. "Yes, madam, though I haven't seen him in some weeks." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "He wasn't always like he is now, you know. Before your mother passed, Horace Lawson was one of the most respected men in the county, finest horseman I ever saw." "Mrs. Holloway," Daniel interrupted gently but firmly. "Perhaps Miss Lawson would prefer different conversation after her journey." The housekeeper flushed slightly. "Of course, forgive me. Old women forget their manners sometimes." She brightened. "I've prepared the spare bedroom upstairs for myself tonight, Mr. Xavier. With a young lady on the property now, it wouldn't be proper for me to leave until I've shown her the ropes." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Holloway. Miss Lawson is an employee, not a social guest requiring chaperonage." "Nevertheless," the older woman said primly, "appearances matter, especially when a reputation is involved." She gave Violet a meaningful look that suggested she knew more about the town's gossip than she'd let on. Violet felt heat rising to her cheeks. "I assure you, Mrs. Holloway, I'm quite capable of—" "It's settled then, Mrs. Holloway declared with the air of someone not accustomed to being contradicted. "I'll stay tonight and tomorrow, then resume my usual schedule." Daniel merely nodded, apparently recognizing a battle not worth fighting. "As you wish. After supper, Mrs. Holloway insisted on showing Violet around the main house, a tour that included detailed explanations of where everything was kept, which floorboards creaked, and which windows tended to leak during heavy rains. Violet paid careful attention, recognizing that such knowledge might prove useful, but she was also aware of Daniel watching them from his desk in the corner of the sitting room, where he appeared to be reviewing papers. "And this, Mrs. Holloway said proudly, opening the door to a small room off the kitchen, "is where Mr. Xavier keeps his accounts and business papers. It's a mess, as you can see." Violet peered into what had once been a pantry, now converted into a cramped office. Papers were stacked haphazardly on every available surface, ledgers lay open at random pages, and receipts spilled from an actual cigar box just as Mrs. Holloway had described. "It's quite a system," Violet managed diplomatically. Mrs. Holloway snorted. "It's no system at all, dear. The man can run a ranch and handle a gun like nobody's business, but ask him to file a piece of paper properly, and he's lost as a lamb in a snowstorm." "I can hear you, Mrs. Holloway," Daniel called from the sitting room, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Good." The housekeeper called back. "Maybe you'll listen this time when I say organization matters." She turned back to Violet with a conspiratorial smile. "That's where you come in, dear. This needs a woman's touch and an educated mind." After the tour concluded, Violet thanked Mrs. Holloway and excused herself to return to her cabin, feeling the weight of the day in her bones. Daniel rose from his desk as she moved toward the door. "Miss Lawson," he said. "A moment, if you please, Mrs." Holloway glanced between them, then discreetly busied herself with clearing the last of the supper dishes, though Violet suspected she was listening intently. Daniel led Violet to the front porch, where the night air was crisp and stars blazed overhead with an intensity only found far from city lights. He closed the door behind them, providing at least the illusion of privacy. "I should clarify your duties," he said without preamble. "The accounts are a mess, as you saw. I need them organized, reconciled, and maintained going forward. I also need correspondence handled, orders for supplies, communications with cattle buyers, that sort of thing." Violet nodded. "I can manage that. When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow." "But there's something else you should know." Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his profile sharp against the starlit sky. "I hired you partly because you're educated, yes, but also because you understand what it means to fight against people's expectations." Violet stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," he replied evenly. "I know your father was once respected and is now the town drunk. I know you went east to study at considerable sacrifice, only to return when your mother died. I know Colorado City has decided what you are without bothering to discover who you are." His accuracy was unsettling. "Have you been investigating me, Mr. Xavier?" A brief smile touched his lips. "In a small town, one doesn't need to investigate. One merely needs to listen." He straightened from the railing. "My point is this. I don't care what they say about you in town. I care about the work you do here. Prove them wrong, Miss Lawson. Prove them all wrong." The intensity in his eyes as he spoke made Violet's breath catch. There was conviction there, and something that looked almost like faith, not in some abstract sense, but in her specifically. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way. "I intend to," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel nodded once. "Good night, then." "I rise early dawn breakfast. Join me or eat later as you prefer." With that, he turned and re-entered the house, leaving Violet alone beneath the vast Colorado sky, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought her here and where it might lead. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Violet threw herself into organizing the chaotic state of the Xavier Ranch's accounts. The work was challenging but satisfying, requiring all her mathematical skills and attention to detail. By the end of her first week, she had established a filing system, reconciled 3 months of transactions, and discovered that the ranch was actually more profitable than Daniel had realized. "You've been undercharging the Millerson operation for grazing rights," she informed him one evening as they sat in the main house, reviewing her findings. "By my calculations, they owe you nearly $300 more than you've collected." Daniel looked up from the neat columns of figures she'd presented, genuine surprise evident in his expression. "That can't be right." "It is." Violet pointed to her calculations. "You agreed to charge them based on acreage used, but when they expanded their herd last spring, no one adjusted the fee. They're grazing nearly 40% more cattle on your land for the same price." He studied the numbers, then shook his head with something like admiration. "I'll be damned." "You're right." He looked at her directly. "This is impressive work, Miss Lawson." Violet felt a flush of pride at his approval. "Thank you. I also found some discrepancies in the supply orders. We're paying too much for feed compared to market rates. I've drafted a letter to negotiate better terms." Daniel leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "You've done more in a week than I expected you to accomplish in a month." "I told you I wasn't a waste," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "You did," he agreed, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before returning to the papers. "And you're proving it every day." Life at the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Violet worked primarily from the small office off the kitchen, organizing records and handling correspondence. Daniel spent most days working with his small crew of ranch hands, 4 men who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn, and treated Violet with a respectful wariness that gradually warmed as they realized she was there to stay. Mrs. Holloway continued her thrice-weekly visits, bringing news from town and taking obvious pleasure in watching the relationship between Daniel and Violet evolve from formal employer-employee to something approaching friendship. They took most meals together now, their conversations growing more comfortable and wide-ranging with each passing day. "You never speak of your time back east," Daniel observed one evening in late November as they sat before the fireplace after supper. Mrs. Holloway having departed earlier due to threatening snow, Violet looked up from the book she'd been reading, one borrowed from his surprisingly extensive library. "You never speak of your time before Colorado," she countered. A smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." He swirled the whiskey in his glass thoughtfully. "Would it surprise you to learn I was once a professor?" Violet's eyebrows rose. "A professor of what?" "Mathematics, primarily, at a small college in Pennsylvania before the war." She studied him with new interest. "What happened?" Daniel's gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "The war happened. I enlisted in '61, served 4 years. By the time it ended, I couldn't imagine returning to lecture halls and faculty meetings." He took a sip of whiskey. "So I came west instead, to become a rancher." Violet couldn't quite reconcile the image of the rugged man before her with that of an academic. "To become someone else," he said simply. "Someone who didn't see dead men every time he closed his eyes." The raw honesty of his admission hung in the air between them, intimate and unexpected. Violet found herself wanting to offer comfort, but unsure how to bridge the sudden vulnerability he'd revealed. "I went to the Rutherford Academy for Women," she said after a moment, offering her own truth in exchange for his. "In Massachusetts. I studied mathematics and literature for 3 years on scholarship. I was supposed to become a teacher." Daniel turned toward her, the firelight casting half his face in warm light, the other in shadow. "What changed?" "My mother's illness, my father's decline. The money ran out." Violet closed her book, running her fingers over its worn cover. "By the time I received word she was dying, it was too late. I arrived home the day after her funeral." "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Everyone was," Violet replied with a hint of bitterness. "Sorry enough to bring casseroles and offer condolences, but not sorry enough to help when Father drank away what little we had left. Not sorry enough to offer me decent work when I tried to rebuild our lives." "Until now," Daniel said. Violet met his gaze. "Until you." "Why did you really hire me, Daniel? The truth this time." He set his glass down, considering her question. "Because I recognized something in you that day at the saloon. Pride, yes, and intelligence, but also a kind of contained fury. The same kind I carried west with me after the war." His eyes never left hers. "And because I believe people deserve second chances, even when the first chance wasn't their fault to lose." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even friendship. Violet felt it like a physical thing. This new awareness of Daniel Xavier not just as the man who'd given her a chance, but as a man who carried his own ghosts, his own regrets, his own carefully guarded heart. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, breaking the spell. Violet rose abruptly, suddenly conscious of their solitude in the firelit room. "I should retire. There's the correspondence to finish tomorrow." Daniel stood as well, maintaining a respectful distance. "Of course. Good night, Miss Lawson." "Violet," she said impulsively. "I think, after all this time, you might call me Violet." A smile, a real one that reached his eyes, transformed his face. "Good night, Violet." "Good night, Daniel." She gathered her shawl and hurried from the room, her heart beating faster than the simple act of standing should warrant. As November gave way to December, the first heavy snow of the season blanketed the ranch in pristine white. The work continued: cattle to tend, accounts to manage, a ranch to run, but the isolation of winter brought its own rhythm to life at the Xavier Ranch. With trips to town limited by weather and necessity, the small community became more self-contained. Daniel and Violet fell into a pattern of evening discussions that ranged far beyond ranch business. They debated literature. He preferred historical accounts. She favored poetry, argued mathematics, their shared passion revealing a more playful side to them both, and gradually, cautiously, shared more of their personal histories. She learned that he'd grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a successful merchant, that he'd been married briefly before the war to a woman who died of typhoid while he was at the front, that he'd come west not just to escape memories, but to find a place where a man was judged by his actions rather than his past. He learned that her mother had encouraged her education against her father's wishes, that she'd once dreamed of opening a school for girls in the West, that she still wrote poetry in a small journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress. What neither acknowledged was the growing attraction between them, the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing documents, the lingering glances across the dinner table, the way conversation flowed between them with increasing ease and intimacy. It was Mrs. Holloway who first gave voice to what others had already observed. On a bitter cold morning in mid-December, as she helped Violet prepare a stew for that evening's meal, the housekeeper broached the subject with her typical directness. "He looks at you differently, you know," she said, vigorously kneading dough for dumplings. Violet nearly dropped the potato she was peeling. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Holloway snorted. "Course you do. I've worked for Mr. Xavier for 3 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." "Mrs. Holloway, really?" Violet protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "It's not like that. He's my employer." "And I'm the Queen of England," the older woman retorted. "I've been around long enough to recognize when two people are dancing around what's plain as day to everyone else." She paused in her kneading, fixing Violet with a kind but penetrating gaze. "He's a good man, Violet. One of the best I've known, and Lord knows he's been alone too long." Violet focused intently on her potato peeling, unable to meet the housekeeper's eyes. "Even if there were feelings, it would be inappropriate. I work for him. I live on his property." "Details, Mrs. Holloway dismissed with a wave of her flour-covered hand. "Those can be sorted out if there's a will to do so. It's more complicated than that," Violet insisted. "My reputation in town is already questionable at best, and Daniel, he deserves someone without my baggage, Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "Oh, child, we all have baggage. The trick is finding someone willing to help carry it." She returned to her dough with renewed vigor. "Besides, the town gossips will talk no matter what you do. Might as well give them something worth talking about." Violet opened her mouth to protest further, but the kitchen door swung open as Daniel himself entered, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were reddened from cold, his breath visible in the frosty air that accompanied him. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, unwinding his scarf. "McKinney and Phillips are bringing the last of the herd down from the north pasture. We might be snowed in for a few days." Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue in concern. "Then I should head back to town before the road becomes impassable." Too late for that, Daniel replied. The creek bridge is already drifted over. You'll have to stay until it clears. The housekeeper shot Violet a look that could only be described as triumphant. Well then, seems we'll have a cozy few days ahead. That evening, with the wind howling outside and snow piling against the windows, the inhabitants of the Xavier Ranch gathered in the main house's sitting room. The ranch hands McKinney, Phillips, Rodriguez, and old Tom Watson had been invited in from their bunkhouse for the duration of the storm, turning the usually quiet house into a hive of activity. Mrs. Holloway presided over the kitchen like a general, enlisting Violet's help in preparing enough food to feed the hungry men. The atmosphere was festive despite, or perhaps because of the storm that had forced them all together. After supper, someone produced a fiddle, and Rodriguez revealed a previously hidden talent for lively tunes. The furniture was pushed back, and impromptu dancing ensued, with Mrs. Holloway partnering each of the hands in turn while Daniel looked on with amused tolerance from his chair by the fire. "Your turn, boss," McKinney called out after a particularly spirited reel had left everyone breathless with laughter. "Miss Lawson hasn't had a proper dance yet." Violet, who had been clapping along from the sidelines, felt suddenly conspicuous as all eyes turned toward her and Daniel. "I wouldn't want to presume," Daniel said carefully, though his eyes held a question as they met Violet's. "It's just a dance," Mrs. Holloway declared, fanning herself dramatically. "For goodness sake, it's practically Christmas. A little merriment won't hurt anyone." Rodriguez struck up a slower tune, and the room fell expectantly silent. Daniel rose from his chair and crossed to where Violet stood, extending his hand with formal courtesy. "Miss Lawson, would you do me the honor?" Violet hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Xavier." His hand was warm and strong around hers as he led her to the center of the room. When he placed his other hand lightly at her waist, Violet became acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd been this close to a man, and never one who affected her the way Daniel Xavier did. They moved together with surprising ease, as if they'd danced 100 times before. The small audience faded from Violet's awareness, leaving only the music, the warmth of the fire, and Daniel's blue eyes locked with hers. "You dance well," he murmured, guiding her through a turn. "So do you," she replied. "Another skill from your previous life." A smile touched his lips. "Some things a man doesn't forget, no matter how far he travels from who he was." Something in his tone made Violet wonder if he was speaking of more than dancing. "And who are you now, Daniel Xavier?" His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. "I'm still discovering that. But I know who I want to be." "And who is that?" The music slowed and Daniel's steps matched its gentler rhythm. "A better man than I was. A man worthy of a second chance." His gaze intensified. "A man worthy of someone like you." Violet's breath caught. Before she could respond, the music ended, and their audience broke into applause, shattering the intimate moment. Daniel released her with proper decorum, stepping back and bowing slightly as if they'd shared nothing more significant than a formal dance. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur for Violet. More music followed, more dancing, more laughter, but she participated as if from a distance, her mind replaying Daniel's words and the look in his eyes when he'd spoken them. As the hour grew late, and the storm continued to rage outside, sleeping arrangements were discussed. The ranch hands would return to their bunkhouse, well stocked with firewood to keep them warm through the night. Mrs. Holloway would take the guest room upstairs as usual. Daniel, of course, had his bedroom off the main sitting room. "And you, Miss Lawson?" Mrs. Holloway asked. Will you brave the storm to return to your cabin, or would you prefer the small room upstairs? It's barely more than a closet, but it has a cot. Violet glanced toward the windows, where snow still whipped against the glass in horizontal sheets. The thought of crossing the yard to her cabin in such conditions was daunting, but the alternative, staying under the same roof as Daniel after their charged exchange, seemed equally intimidating in a different way. I should return to my cabin, she decided. I have work there that needs attention. Daniel frowned. That's not wise. The temperature is dropping and visibility is near zero. I can manage, Violet insisted. It's not that far. Absolutely not, he said, his tone brooking no argument. If you won't take the room upstairs, I'll escort you to your cabin with a lantern and rope, but I won't have you crossing the yard alone in this. His concern touched her even as his authoritative tone rankled. Very well, she conceded, but there's no need to inconvenience everyone. I'll take the upstairs room. Later, lying on the narrow cot in what was indeed little more than a storage room with a window, Violet found sleep elusive. The storm rattled the glass panes and moaned through the eaves, but it was Daniel's words that echoed most persistently in her mind. A man worthy of someone like you. What did he see when he looked at her? Not the failure the town perceived, certainly. Not the burden her father considered her to be in his rare moments of sobriety. But what, exactly? And more troublingly, what did she want him to see? Violet turned restlessly on the thin mattress, pulling the borrowed quilt tighter around her shoulders. She had come to the Xavier Ranch desperate for work, for a chance to prove herself. She hadn't come looking for. Whatever this was developing between her and Daniel, attachment was dangerous. She had learned that lesson painfully with her father, watching him sink further into drink after her mother's death, despite Violet's every effort to save him. Caring too deeply meant risking devastation when the inevitable disappointment came. And yet she couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when Daniel entered a room, or the ease she felt in his company, or the growing certainty that he truly saw her in a way no one else ever had. Outside, the storm continued its assault, much like the conflicting emotions battling within her. Violet finally drifted into uneasy sleep with no resolution, only the knowledge that something had shifted irrevocably between them and that sooner or later, she would have to decide whether to embrace that change or retreat from it. Morning arrived with blinding brightness as sunlight reflected off fresh snow. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear blue sky. Violet stood at the upstairs window, marveling at the beauty that followed such violent weather, nature's reminder that even the fiercest storms eventually yielded to calm. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Holloway already busy in the kitchen, the aroma of coffee and frying bacon filling the house. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. He's out checking the livestock, Mrs. Holloway explained without being asked, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon across the table to Violet. Been up since before dawn, that man. Never rests when there's work to be done. Violet accepted the food gratefully, realizing how hungry she was. Will the road to town be passable soon? Mrs. Holloway shrugged. Maybe by tomorrow if the sun stays strong. Mr. Xavier sent Rodriguez and Phillips out to start clearing the worst drifts. She sat down opposite Violet with her own plate. No rush on my account. I'm quite comfortable here. The knowing look that accompanied this statement made Violet focus intently on her breakfast. The day passed in a flurry of activity as everyone worked to restore order after the storm. Fences needed checking, animals required feed and fresh water, and drifts had to be cleared from doorways and paths. Violet insisted on doing her part, helping Mrs. Holloway prepare meals for the hard-working men and then bundling up to assist with some of the lighter outdoor tasks. It was late afternoon when Daniel found her in the barn, where she'd gone to check on a newborn calf that had arrived just before the storm. The young animal lay nestled in clean straw, its mother standing protectively nearby as Violet knelt to examine it. "She seems to be doing well," Daniel observed, his sudden appearance startling Violet. "Yes," she agreed, rising to her feet and brushing straw from her skirts. "She's nursing properly now. I was concerned yesterday when she seemed reluctant." Daniel leaned against a post, studying Violet with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "You've become quite the rancher in these past weeks." "Hardly," she demurred. "But I'm learning. It's satisfying work." "Is it?" he asked. "More satisfying than teaching mathematics to young women in the East?" The question caught her off guard. "That was a different life, a different plan." "Plans can change," Daniel said quietly. "Sometimes for the better, even when we don't recognize it at first." Something in his tone made Violet look at him more closely. There was an intensity to his gaze that both thrilled and unsettled her. "Daniel," she began, unsure what she meant to say. "I'm riding into town tomorrow," he interrupted. "The road should be clear enough by morning. I need to check mail, place orders for supplies." He paused. "Would you like to accompany me?" The invitation surprised her. "To town? I don't know if that's wise. Because of what people might say." His voice held no judgment, only genuine inquiry. "Partly," Violet admitted. "My reputation there isn't exactly stellar." Daniel stepped closer. "And if I don't care about that, you should," she said softly. "Reputations matter in places like Colorado City, especially for a businessman like yourself." "My business is my ranch, and my ranch is thriving in no small part thanks to you." He reached out, hesitating briefly before gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Violet found herself momentarily unable to breathe. "I've been thinking," Daniel continued, his hand dropping back to his side, "about what you said when I hired you, about being called a waste." Violet tensed. "What about it?" "I promised to spend every day proving them wrong. I'd like to know if I've succeeded, even a little." The vulnerability in his question touched something deep within her. "Yes," she whispered. More than a little, relief visibly passed across his features. "Good, that's good," he cleared his throat. "About town tomorrow, I'll go," Violet said suddenly, surprising herself as much as him. "You're right. It's time I stopped hiding." Daniel's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "We'll leave after breakfast then." As he turned to go, Violet called after him. "Daniel, thank you, not just for the work, but for believing in me when no one else did." He looked back at her, his expression serious. "Don't thank me for seeing what was always there, Violet. That's not kindness, it's just having eyes to see." The ride to Colorado City the following day was both longer and shorter than Violet remembered. Longer because anticipation and anxiety stretched each mile into an eternity. Shorter because Daniel's company made the journey pass in pleasant conversation about everything from cattle prices to the book of poetry he'd noticed on her bedside table during a recent visit to her cabin. As the buildings of Colorado City came into view, Violet felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. She hadn't returned since the day Daniel had hired her at the saloon, and the prospect of facing the town's judgment again filled her with dread. Daniel seemed to sense her discomfort. "We don't have to do this today if you're not ready." Violet straightened her shoulders. "No, I can't hide forever. Besides, I need a few personal items that Mrs. Holloway can't bring from her own supplies." He nodded, respecting her determination. "We'll start at the general store, then the post office. If you'd prefer to avoid the saloon entirely." "I would," Violet said quickly. The town was relatively quiet as they rode in, the recent snow having kept many people at home. Still, Violet felt eyes on her as Daniel helped her down from her horse in front of Johnson's general store. She recognized Mrs. Peterson and her daughter across the street, their heads bent together in obvious gossip as they watched. "Ignore them," Daniel murmured, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the store. Mr. Johnson looked up from his ledger, his expression registering surprise at seeing Violet. "Miss Lawson," he greeted her cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you back in town, Mr. Johnson," Violet replied with more confidence than she felt. "I've been working at the Xavier Ranch these past weeks." The storekeeper's eyes darted between Violet and Daniel, clearly making assumptions about the nature of their relationship. "I see. Well, what can I help you with today?" Daniel stepped forward. "We need supplies." He handed over a list that Violet had prepared, "and Miss Lawson has some personal items to purchase as well." Mr. Johnson accepted the list with a nod. "I'll get this together for you, Mr. Xavier. Miss Lawson can browse as she needs." As the storekeeper moved away to gather their order, Daniel touched Violet's arm lightly. "I need to check on something at the blacksmith's. Will you be all right here for a few minutes?" Violet nodded, though the thought of being left alone made her nervous. "Of course, I'll be fine." Daniel studied her face for a moment, then seemed satisfied with what he saw. "I won't be long." After he departed, Violet wandered through the store, selecting the few items she needed: a new hairbrush, some writing paper, a small bottle of rosewater that was her one indulgence. She was examining a display of ribbons when a familiar voice behind her made her blood run cold. Well, if it isn't my darling daughter, finally deigning to return to town." Violet turned slowly to face her father. Horace Lawson had once been a handsome man, tall and strong, but years of hard drinking had left him gaunt and prematurely aged. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, and the sour smell of whiskey clung to him even at this early hour. "Hello, Father," she said quietly, conscious of Mr. Johnson watching from behind his counter and several other customers who had paused their shopping to observe the exchange. Horace swayed slightly on his feet. "Don't father me, girl. Where have you been?" Ran off without a word, leaving your own flesh and blood to fend for himself. "I left a note," Violet replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And I've sent money twice since I've been gone." He waved his hand dismissively. "Pennies. Not enough to keep a man in basic necessities." "You mean whiskey," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her tone. Horace's face darkened dangerously. "Watch your tongue. I'm still your father and you still owe me respect." He stepped closer, and Violet caught the full force of the alcohol fumes on his breath. "Word is you're living out at the Xavier place. Playing house with that fancy rancher, are you?" Heat rushed to Violet's face. "I'm employed there as an accountant. It's respectable work." Horace let out a bark of laughter. "Respectable, she says. That's rich, coming from a girl who abandoned her own father to shack up with. That's enough, Lawson." Daniel's voice cut through the store like a whip crack. He stood in the doorway, his expression hard as he assessed the situation. Violet had never seen him look so forbidding. Horace turned unsteadily, squinting at the newcomer. "Xavier, is it? The man who's taken my daughter?" "I haven't taken anyone," Daniel replied, his voice controlled but edged with steel. "Miss Lawson is my employee and you're causing her distress." "She's my daughter," Horace insisted, his voice rising. "I have rights." "Not to harass her in public," Daniel countered, moving to Violet's side. "Are you all right?" he asked her quietly. Violet nodded, though she felt anything but all right. The scene was exactly what she'd feared, her father's drunken accusations confirming the town's worst suspicions about her arrangement with Daniel. "We're leaving," Daniel told Horace firmly. "Mr. Johnson will deliver our supplies to the ranch later. Miss Lawson, shall we?" He offered his arm, and Violet took it gratefully, desperate to escape the stares and whispers that had erupted around them. "You can't take her," Horace protested, lurching forward to grab Violet's other arm. "She has responsibilities, debts. Let go of me," Violet said, trying to pull away. "Your debts are your own, Lawson," Daniel said coldly. "Whatever you've squandered is on your head, not hers." Horace's grip tightened painfully. "You high and mighty bastard. You think you can just—" What happened next occurred so quickly that Violet barely registered the sequence of events. One moment Horace was gripping her arm and threatening Daniel. The next, he was sprawled on the floor of the general store, looking up in shock as Daniel stood over him, fists clenched. "Don't ever put your hands on her again," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "Not if you value what's left of your miserable life." The store had gone completely silent. Mr. Johnson stood frozen behind his counter, a sack of flour still clutched in his hands. The other customers stared in fascination at the tableau before them, the town drunk laid out on the floor, the usually reserved rancher standing protectively beside the woman everyone had written off as a failure. "You'll regret this, Xavier," Horace spat, struggling to his feet with as much dignity as his inebriated state allowed. "Nobody lays hands on Horace Lawson without consequences." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I look forward to your attempt at retribution. Now get out before I decide you need another lesson in manners." For a tense moment, Violet thought her father might actually try to fight. But self-preservation won out over pride, and Horace stumbled toward the door, pausing only to point an unsteady finger at his daughter. "You're no daughter of mine," he declared loudly. "Siding with him against your own blood, your mother would be ashamed." The words struck Violet like physical blows. She swayed slightly, and Daniel's arm immediately went around her waist to steady her. "Your mother," he said with quiet intensity, "would be proud of the woman you've become. Now get out, Lawson, before you embarrass yourself further." Horace glared at them both, then staggered out into the street, muttering curses as he went. The moment he was gone, Daniel turned to Violet, his expression softening with concern. "Are you hurt? Did he injure your arm?" Violet shook her head, though her arm did throb where her father had gripped it. "I'm fine, just mortified."